We have Nick and Sarah, don't we? As well as the rest of us.
Deloitte for item 1.
What's that?
In Deloitte for item 1.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not for the apologies, but for, yes. Confirmation of the agenda. Has anybody got anything that they wanted to add? No? Conflict of interest? Any interests pertaining to this meeting or any new interests? No? No public forum has been advised. Confirmation of the previous minutes. Happy to move.
Seconded.
Any problems? Okay. With the agreement of you all, they're confirmed. That's the minutes of the public meeting. Actions. No actions left over from previous times. And moving on to matters for decision, which brings in and welcome the Deloitte team, who are about to present our audit planning report. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I guess I just want to check and make sure the report is obviously there in full. I won't go through everything in great detail unless you particularly want me to, but I'll go through and do a summary of what's there and then open it up to you for discussion if you're happy with that approach. So just to highlight, I think I'll start on page 14 of your pack, which is just sort of the introduction to the audit. That you will get to there. Yeah. And it really just an introduction to what the audit process is, and in line with what we would do. Every year we would bring to you a planning report that talks about the areas of focus and where we intend to spend most of our audit time, I guess, over the next year. This is sort of the planning stage where we've obviously had discussions with management. We've got information from previous audits and a variety of reasons where we bring things in to look at the areas that we plan to focus on for this year. This is your opportunity to obviously discuss that with us and understand if there's areas that you also think should be added to this that perhaps are not in our areas of focus. I guess the thing is that what we do in terms of an audit is we address it, we look at it now from a risk-based approach, but it's always changing. So whilst this is our thoughts right now, as things evolve, particularly around, we'll talk about the COVID-19 type stuff over the next wee while, but if things change in that process, then our risk approach and what our audit procedures might change as well during that course. So we will certainly, when we come back at the end of the audit, we will report to you where we're at in terms of this, but we'll also talk to you about where things have changed and we've done additional things as necessary through that piece. And in line with, I think you'll see, in line with what we've done in the past, a lot of the key audit areas are similar to prior years, but the main change this year is really that COVID-19 impact. I anticipate that the majority of the impact will be around balance sheet type stuff at 30 June, as opposed to sort of the operating P&L type impact in this particular financial year. Given predominantly because most of the rates will already be collected or primarily in prior to that 30 June piece. But we will also look to see what changes over that period, sort of from March, April, May through to June, around fees collection or consents that may have dropped away or changed over that time. So that's sort of the main area of focus. The things that we sort of see as big changes, I guess, out of that COVID-19 period will be around valuations. And you do have some pretty significant valuations on your balance sheet, potentially. The investments from a council perspective this year's in Port Otago are carried at fair value, so there's a valuation performed at 30 June. So there's obviously some significant judgments that go into that valuation process, and we'll have to see what evolves over the next few months as to what that looks like when that's done. On a slightly smaller scale, investment property is also carried at fair value, and depending on what happens with the market at the moment, it's pretty stagnant given the lockdown period. There's certainly material valuation uncertainty out there at the moment around valuations, and we'll see where that progresses when we get to that 30 June position. Other things that may need some focus will be also around things like collectability of receivables in terms of whether there's doubtful debts. Historically, not an area of significant focus from a council perspective, because normally it's pretty good around that area, but just have to see what happens in terms of the ability of people to be able to pay in this time of uncertainty. So that's sort of in a nutshell the things. I'll just go through. So page 15 is just a wee summary of the approach. So at this point, we're bringing you our planning document. We will go in and do an interim audit in a couple of weeks' time. And during that time, we'll be looking at systems and processes and internal controls, and also looking at our scoping and understanding whether there's any changes we need to make in terms of our risk focus and areas of audit focus. And then obviously later in the year, we'll come back and do our final audit, and then we'll come back and report to you off the back of that process. Page 16 just highlights really that obviously the audit isn't about being able to give you absolute certainty. It's a fairly presents type position with reasonable assurance that the financial statements as a whole are not materially misstated. And so I guess there is a materiality concept that does get applied, and usually that is on a basis of a percentage on expenditure. Page 17 is really just a dashboard there of summarising the key risks, the areas of focus, and how they sort of play out in terms of where we think the judgments are. You'll see there the valuation of Port Otago shares. It doesn't raise a significant risk right at this point, but I actually think in reality it will probably get raised to a significant risk in terms of our audit procedures, based on what we're seeing in the market and the likely judgments that are going to be going into that valuation when we get to 30 June.
So you're saying, sorry, through you, yeah. Are you saying that the level of that valuation, or just how it's going to be, how that valuation is going to be created?
Correct. So from our point of view, things are significant when there's a lot of judgment that goes into developing what that number is. And I think given the uncertainty in the market, and what we're seeing is there's uncertainty in valuations, and generally valuations at the moment even state that they have material uncertainty around that value, that it gives a sort of a higher risk weighting to those numbers. Yeah. So just moving along, page 18, just looking at rates. So rates is an area that we, particularly around the accuracy of rates, is an area that we see as a presumed risk. The auditing standards have a presumed risk of fraud around revenue, and we obviously rates revenue is fairly significant to the council, and that's the area that we focus on. Just some of the procedures, that's not everything we do, but there are just some of the procedures listed there in terms of how we approach that. That's largely unchanged. There's a fairly prescribed set of rules and questionnaires that come out from the OAG about how we address rates, and we apply those each year. Certainly.
Hilary?
Can you go into more detail about the suggestion about the rates not being set in accordance with the Local Government Act, and I presume that's targeted versus general. And but I came from another council where we dealt with it quite differently. And can you tell us more about how you're seeing that happen, or has the OAG given have you got some guidelines that we should be also seeing?
No, there's not guidelines. We follow the Act, the Local Government Rating Act, obviously, and I mean it's only around it only becomes an issue when you set a new rate, usually, and it's obviously around the long-term plan timing that often happens. We usually go through the process. So you have an in-house counsel that does the assessment in terms of compliance with the Local Government Rating Act around that, and then we obviously look at that, and then if there is any doubt around it, we do go to the OAG for they have specific advisors in that space that help us assess it, and then we come back on that process. Yeah.
Andrew? You any questions?
I had a query. It's more relates to your introduction about the ability to pay, and it's probably more of a question for either Nick or Sarah. But put yourself in the position of someone unable to pay. Is the process very much contacting the rates department and having a conversation about your situation and hopefully resolving it in some way, shape or form? And I assume that conversation will be confidential, etc. Are you able just to flesh out why? I know it's slightly away from what we're here for today, but is someone just able to flesh out where we sit with the policy dealing with that sort of situation?
Yeah, so I think more the question that we're talking about collectability is not so much around rates, because rates, obviously at this point we've already got a huge portion, and we've got the direct debit ability, and if people are struggling, we encourage them to talk to us, and we'll put payment arrangements and various things in place. And the key thing is that if they've been in contact with us, then that'll put a hold on any penalties that may be charged on top. But rates, you've got to remember that the rates will still get charged even if they don't get paid. They sit on the property and will get recovered when that property is sold. So there might be a timing difference, but it's not an issue of ultimate collectability. I think what the auditors are referring to more around collectability will be around all of our other sources of income, which is around fees and charges, any other lease payments and various things that we have, whether there's any issues around there. But because obviously we don't have the rating mechanism of being able to attach that to to a property and recover via an ultimate sale.
So the focus very much on the full ability to collect that revenue across the board. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Andrew D, have you any questions?
You're still going?
Yep.
Yep. No. Continue. Heavy.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
We'll
Yep.
get to the end and see if
sorry. I'm heavy. Yep.
Sure.
Sorry.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so we'll just keep moving along. The next area is just management overrider controls, and this is another area that's just a significant risk and a fraud risk under the auditing standards. So it's just it's an area where we have to do audit work, and it's really around the presumption that management is always in the position to potentially override a control in a fraudulent way. It's not saying that it's happened, it's just that it's a presumed risk from an audit perspective. So it just means that we do specific procedures around that to try and look at ways of ensuring that that's not occurring. And you'll just see in the report there, the main area of that is around, from a financial reporting perspective, it's around journal entries, looking at a sample of sort of risk-focused journal entries throughout the period, looking at accounting estimates, which is the valuation type things that we've just talked about before, looking at how judgments were made in the previous year and how they've changed particularly around estimates in the current year, to see if there's change in assumptions that could be looking at ways of manipulating a result, or if there was any unusual transactions that have occurred in the current year. Now, I haven't got any specific examples for the current year to give, but those are the sort of areas that we focus on in that space. On page 19, so the next one is the one I mentioned before, which is the valuation of the port shares. So obviously council gets an independent valuer to do that assessment, and I guess we will be watching this space, but at the moment I would be expecting that, similar to other valuations, that there will be some material valuation uncertainty around that approach, just because given the uncertainty from COVID-19, whilst the assumptions may be similar that have gone into that approach as they have in previous years, the certainty around the economic outlook that goes with those is just a little bit more shaky, I guess, than what might have been there before. It's very hard to crystal ball gaze given where we're at the moment. From our perspective, we will obviously talk to the valuer and challenge some of that approach, and we also get our own corporate finance, so our own sort of evaluation experts internally to have a look at that as well, to help challenge that approach and look at that valuation. The statement of service performance, I guess the key thing here is really we want to make sure that the story is being told, and I think we had a number of discussions in previous years just around making sure that that's well fleshed out and explains where there's differences, I guess, from the way the levels of services have been performed, and making sure that story's been communicated well. There's a few things that we do there in terms of looking at against legislative requirements, and obviously looking at the reported performance measures for a sample of significant groups of services. And then the narrative commentary is probably the most important piece, that just really explains how council has performed relative to what it said it would. Moving on, page 20, the group audit and consolidation. So bringing in the Port Otago Group subsidiary. It's obviously a very significant part of the Otago Regional Council group. They do report on a different set of financial reporting standards to council. So there is an element of changes from their financial statements to what goes into the group. for Otago Regional Council, and the new one that will impact them this year is that leases. There's a new leasing standard from Port Otago's perspective. So there'll be new assets and liabilities on their financial statements, and there'll be a change in the way operating leases are recorded in their profit and loss. And that will have to be reversed such that it comes through into the group for Otago Regional Council. So there's just going to be a little bit more work there in terms of that consolidation process for the current year. I didn't mention there, but Audit New Zealand is the auditors of Port Otago, so we communicate with them. We rely on a lot of the work that they do around Port Otago. So we issue them with group instructions around the audit process and what we want them to look at. We also go and look at their audit files. We ask them to give us a number of their work papers, in particular around the valuations for the investment properties in relation to the port. So we obviously have to make sure that we're comfortable that the figures that are being brought up into the council's group financial statements are appropriate.
Would you be, or who is, taking an interest in potential fraud in those areas?
In port?
Yes.
So Audit New Zealand are responsible for looking at that within port.
I'm not suggesting for a moment, I'm just saying. So
obviously the board of directors...
Because the port is essentially majorly, from an investment point of view, from us, the income is Chalmers Properties. So it's not although it's a port company, it's sort of only once you get to Chalmers Properties, it's like a property company, not a port company. But they're presumably therefore auditing it as a port, if you see what I mean, using the port lens.
Audit New Zealand have the same responsibilities under the auditing standards regardless of what type of entity it is. They will certainly apply those standards across all of the port company. It won't matter. They will look at all of Chalmers Properties, the port operations across the board. They won't be looking at it from one slant or another. They will cover those auditing standards across the board. And obviously the board of directors at Port Otago are responsible for ensuring, they've got the systems and controls in place to mitigate fraud across all of its entities, obviously not just its port company.
Right. I'm intrigued, and I'm going to go backwards now, which I don't like doing usually, but you talked about the management override of controls, and that doesn't necessarily just have to be about fraud. It can be about bias or preference to one group over another and things like that. Do you go into that as well? I mean, democracy is fraud is at one extreme of making judgments that are wrong, but do you look at preference to some parties over others when it comes to how some things are paid and some things aren't? In light of people making claims to the ORC during events and things like that. Some things get paid and others don't. And I'm just wondering, is that equally up there under your management override of controls to see that judgment is consistent?
No, management override is specifically around fraud. That is an auditing standard piece. But I guess what the bits that you're thinking about are probably more around sensitive expenditure type stuff that is covered by more the Auditor General's type auditing standards, and we certainly do a whole bunch of testing. We'll come on to it in a wee bit actually, around that sensitive type stuff. So it's not just, sensitive expenditure is around perhaps looking at, say, Sarah's expenses and something like that, but there is also decision making to some degree and legislative compliance as it all relates to the financial statements as a whole, though. Yep. We don't look at all areas that would be impossible.
Yep. Yeah, I was just wondering if it's on a spectrum that you look at things, fraud being at one end, whereas as you go into preferences for any reason or judgment calls on, and whether at the moment we've got COVID response, we're paying out some people for emergencies, and I don't know if we're not paying out people. I don't know, but I'm just wondering where that judgment line is audited.
So that's management's responsibility to determine the policies for council and to imply those. We will certainly look at things as they relate to the financial statements as a whole, or if it was the SSP or other requirements that we have to report against, or you have to report against under the Local Government Act. But to that extent, it's not something that we would be specifically considering.
Yep, no, that's cool. I'm just trying to get my head around where that stuff is.
So just on the next page, 21, that's just the OAG audit brief. There really hasn't been a great deal of change. I appreciate that some of you are new to this specific committee, but there hasn't been a lot of change in terms of the Auditor General's specific requirements for the current year, and they've not asked for anything. In some years they ask for additional activities to be undertaken outside of the audit process, but there's nothing in place for the current year. They have highlighted the Auditor General's work program, and he's specifically focusing on procurement, but nothing has come out of that in terms of additional work that we have to do in the current period. They've also highlighted, obviously just ahead of the 2021 long-term plan process, around thinking about ensuring you've got good performance information around critical assets. Legislative compliance remains applicable, and obviously related party transactions, conflicts of interest, sensitive expenditure type stuff remains there. And then just the next page, page 22, this is really just sort of wrapping up into a one-way place, the impacts of COVID. I mean, COVID isn't really a thing in itself in terms of what will happen in the financial statements, but I guess it's an overlaying thought process in terms of every balance that we will need to consider as we go through that audit process. So it's just bearing in mind that there may be uncertainty, and we will be looking at that as we get towards that year-end process. It's just the timeline's in place. I won't propose to go through all the following pages, but perhaps I'll just stop there, and if there's any more questions.
Just on that particular COVID section there, in normal years, if we ever have another normal year, have you got the same consideration, but called arising from market forces, or
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we've tagged this year, but next year it could be just your standard market forces, or.
And look, all of the things that are there are things that we would consider, I guess, in a normal year. Anything that you would say that might be slightly risky because of a COVID type thing are all areas that we would consider important from an audit perspective anyway. It's just another layer that we add to our consideration as we're thinking about the impact, and it's particularly around where you have valuations that have got some element of having to think about forecasting into the future, and where that forecast may be a little less certain. Yeah.
So consolidating the report is, of course, something that you'll need to make sure you've got plenty of time and time to think through and understanding of anything that might come out of that. In terms of your relationship with OAG, sort of in the past, how has that sort of been in terms of timing and getting things done? Because I know that's often could be a bit of the squeeze point in an audit to make sure you've got enough.
Audit New Zealand?
Yes.
Yeah, yep. Absolutely. Well, we have already had communications with the partner or the director at Audit New Zealand, and we usually meet with them sort of two or three times over that period. It's always been fine, particularly the last couple of years. The timing's been good, and that they're generally finished around that sort of end of August, first week of September in terms of the port operations, which gives plenty of time to bring that consolidation in. And I believe the timing for end of September this year is similar to previous, and Port are not indicating any issues in terms of a change to their current process either, so I think we'll be fine.
Yeah, certainly. It's from experience with those things, it's making sure you've got enough time to have those discussions and bring anything back to a forum to discuss any possible impacts. So
absolutely.
Sort of,
Absolutely, and we'll stay in touch with, if there is any indication that Port is not going to meet its timelines, then we will be talking to management here about whether that puts any pressure on those timeframes, for council.
And just on, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Just on the internal controls piece, it'd be quite good to know, you'll likely present back your findings on the internal controls in terms of exceptions, and it would be good to see, I guess, the types of internal controls that are looked at and tested, and just sort of the outcome at a high level of those. I'm sure sort of exceptions are sort of always presented back, but possibly we get a view of what was covered. Just sort of helps give some comfort to the floor here too.
Absolutely, that's part of the normal process, and we normally include those as part of that final reporting process. Yeah.
Thank you for your comment. And something I've got no suspicions, but I just want to understand process. You say that the council laws should feed in at some stage, or the council, and I presume it's through this committee, feed in any concerns that you want. At what part of that process does that happen? Because it certainly wouldn't happen in public. It would happen in a closed part, and I don't think you're here for the closed part today. Do you have a meeting with us sometimes later?
Absolutely. Ordinarily, we would try and have all of these audit meetings in the closed part for that ability, but understood it was wanted to be public today. But yes, certainly further down the track, we will have be in closed meeting to have that discussion.
Right, Andrew Noon.
Thank you. Just reflecting on last year's process, the idea of ensuring that we inform our community about where we're tracking and what we're trying to achieve in terms of our annual plan, etc. There was a suggestion that we required, additional explanation or whatever. Is the Auditor General, or do the Office of the Auditor General have any particular view in terms of saturation of that information across the ratepayer base, if you understand what I'm saying? Because I remember we had a conversation here about the importance to connect with every ratepayer, i.e. dropping in a brochure that covers off that sort of information. Is there any particular process that the Auditor General would embrace more so than other processes, i.e. something in a letterbox rather than perhaps adverts in local magazine or not local, community papers, regional papers, etc.? Just any thoughts?
Is that in relation to the annual report, or are you talking about in terms of?
Well, it's a signal that was given 12 months ago that we were required to, as I say, provide further information. So what I'm trying to ascertain is that...
Understatement of service performance, wasn't it?
Thank you. That's the correct language. So I'm just trying to understand, is there a particular, process to follow to avoid receiving that sort of comment in the future? Okay, put out more detailed information. Is that the only way to deal with it? Are there other ways to skin the cat, for want of a better term?
In terms of this process, the statement of service performance does form part of the annual report, and so the commentary against it has to be in that document, essentially, because that's the accountability document that we have to audit against. If it was outside of that process in terms of a pamphlet or something else, that would need to be in addition to the what was actually put into the annual report and the statement of service performance.
I was just thinking that how we tell the people out there about the service performance is partially that, isn't it? I mean, you can say it can be in our annual report effectively, but we still have to tell people. You can't just say, oh, we've got an annual report. Maybe if you just said pop in and look and I'll see if I can find it in the bottom drawer, it wouldn't do. So perhaps that's what Andrew's sort of alluding to, that we've got to actually get it out there. We've not only got to have the right stuff in it, but we've got to have it available in some sensible fashion, I presume. But you don't care how we would make it available. That's
council's decision how they want to, send it to their community.
Are you still going?
Oh, I'm good.
I take it you've got something early on here saying that you're in touch in general from time to time with our staff and things. I take it you would be available likewise to our committee if we just have further questions and from time to time have questions, because as things change from your end, they may be changing from our end.
Absolutely.
Too. So not that we're going to be ringing you on the hour or anything, but I just like to have the comfort of feeling that you consider yourself available to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Have you got anything? Anyone else?
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you certainly can. And Councillor Noon
Happy to move.
and
We received
Councillor
the report.
Malcolm. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
I'm just not,
Also,
for some reason.
come and sit over there.
It's the fact that you should have to clean down the desks and everything afterwards.
The COVID impact.
I think that's the rules, isn't it, Amanda? It's easier wipes, so you're welcome to, if you would like to, we can wipe down the desks.
It's up to you.
I'm happy here. I'm sure Sarah's happy not seeing me.
We've got Tracy, but at least she lives up Middlemount somewhere.
You can just call out if I'm not.
Yeah,
seeing
no,
you
I can
properly.
hear you. That's fine.
Right. Moving on to matters for noting.
Can I just go back to
sorry,
that report?
yes.
Sorry, so Nick, you're
sorry.
comfortable with that process and it historically
Yes,
works
so-
pretty good?
I'm thinking it's 8.
I know it's a compulsory sort of thing we have to do, but yeah.
It's a standard process, and as they've pointed out, there's just obviously COVID will be an overlay consideration, and there is the OAG always has some areas of focus, and they're pretty much the same. The one that is added in a little that they're going to focus on a bit more this year is procurement. So, but apart from that, it's business as usual, and obviously Sarah's got good dialogue going with the port already, and the next item is just the annual report. It sort of aligns with this. It's the annual report timetable and matters under consideration, which outlines some of those issues that changes in accounting standards in particular that we're looking at, and in relation to how ours differs from the port. But that's all, there's work to do, but it's all in hand.
Yep, good, thanks, Nick. Thank you.
And are we therefore wanting to move on and receive the annual report timetable? Or are we wanting to talk to that? Or would somebody like to move it and then talk to it?
Page 32 of the agenda.
Yeah.
I'm happy to move that we receive the report. Sorry, yes.
Second that.
Those in favour?
Aye.
Right, I think we're done with 8. Moving on to the health and safety report. Any queries or discussion about the health and safety report?
Just standard.
Yeah, I'll just say I think we've introduced in the previous meeting Audit and Risk, Rebecca, our safety and wellbeing partner, and her manager, Nicole. So you'll see that there's some growing evidence of the continuous improvement journey that health and safety and wellbeing is on in IRC, and building, in fact, embedding it into the culture through
Would some of you like to come
partnership. So yes,
a wee bit
Rebecca
closer
will-
where we can
Yeah,
hear you,
sure.
or are you?
Rebecca will
Trying not to
pop round here.
get too close to people, but I'll hop around this way.
Sorry, I interrupted.
That's all right. I've just
Sally.
a very quick introduction, and really just over to Rebecca now to introduce your report.
Thank you. So hopefully you've all had a chance to read through the report. I'm just going to take the report as read, and if there's already on.
I was going to ask around sort of a bit of a discussion there on COVID related, and just sort of I guess people being out of the office for a while, and what's the thoughts around any sort of lessons learned? I'm not too sure if it's for you in this area or elsewhere, in terms of just the staff that have been working away from home, or staff working in a new environment, and there would have been quite a lot of lessons learned, I imagine, over the last 8 weeks, and sort of just, I guess, making note of those, realising that the situation may come back, and that sort of identifying those lessons learned. So just wondering if there has sort of been a process like that undergone.
Did you want me to speak to that?
Yes, no, you go for it.
Yeah, so I guess I guess from a safety perspective, there's been a huge amount of work around that transition, sitting people up safely at home, and a lot of resources put together, our working from home toolkit put together for staff with a lot of help from IT to make sure everyone's set up from home. There's been a lot of communication happening with staff members while they've been at home to make sure that people are still, I guess, connected to the workplace, both probably more mentally rather than and psychologically rather than physically, because often, people can get isolated. So we've put a lot of new things in place around, we've got a weekly newsletter that comes out now, which is really engaging. And I know myself, I'm kind of always keen to read the recipes and just people's pets and things like that that's been going on. I know from a safety perspective in particular, we've continued to have a lot of our health and safety meetings just remotely through Zoom. We're obviously making the most of technologies. So all of those activities have still been happening, and any hazards and risks that have been emerging from working from home, tripping over the dog or something on the way to the fridge, the different types of hazards in a home environment that obviously, people haven't had before have still been raised. And in terms of just, I guess, getting used to the way people are working and thinking about how that might change the future, there's been a lot of work around just working with the continuity management team as well, and the management team as a whole, around what are the learnings. Each manager has had a team meeting to run through with their own individual team what's worked, what hasn't, what are the sort of things that we might want to take on for the future. And so there's going to be more work around that to look at perhaps what can we offer in terms of flexibility, for some people that might want to work from home once a week and things like that, and how can working from home perhaps be integrated to increase productivity and things like that. So there's definitely been a lot of, I guess, starting to build that picture around what are the learnings and how can we actually start incorporating this into our way of life moving forward, rather than just, next week, couple of weeks, we're moving on back to the way we were.
I ask whether your home therefore becomes your workplace.
Sorry,
your home becomes the workplace?
Essentially it is, yeah.
So if at lunchtime I'm not working, but I get on a ladder and get up to the high shelf to get some jam for my toast, fall off, it's a workplace accident, is it?
Yeah, look, it gets a little bit grey. Essentially, we're responsible for people from when they start, work until the end of the day. And even if I walk down to the cafe in my lunch break and sprain my ankle if I'm at the office, that could still technically be considered to be a workplace injury. I think we also need to be mindful about, people taking unnecessary risks as well in their lunch break. Like if I'm going to go to the gym and lift heavy weights in my lunch break and hurt myself, would that be a workplace injury? If I'm going to climb up on a ladder in my lunch break at home, would that be considered to be reasonable? But at the end of the day, I guess with ACC here covering workplace injuries, I've just come over from Australia, so it's a little bit different. The person is still going to be covered for their injury, and in terms of the person's return to work and rehabilitation, it doesn't make any difference. We would still treat them the same and rehabilitate them.
Although I gather we could be sued for not taking all reasonable steps to look after them if they...
We do have a lot of tools and checklists in place that people can use at home. So we've got ergonomic checklists that the person needs to complete to make sure they're ergonomically set up, and obviously speak to their manager if there's any concerns with, their chair is uncomfortable or something like that. And also we've got general checklists in place around just making sure the home environment is safe when the home is your workplace. So it is very difficult because I guess you can't control everything that people are going to do at home. So you've got to set up those reasonable expectations for people. And I guess we need to just do anything that we feel is reasonably practical to make sure people are set up at home. But I guess there's got to be a limit to that. We can't be going to assess everyone's home environment to make sure that, the steps to their front door aren't slippery or something like that. There's got to be a bit of a limit to what is considered.
Okay, then, Andrew.
Oh, sorry. On that count, and the ODT ran headlines earlier in the week, I think, about a terrible type of program that people working at home can be looked at and checked and everything, and the privacy issues also that come around that. We're not. What's the view of health and safety about that sort of technology? I presume it's not applied.
In terms of like Zoom and sort of being on camera?
Oh no, it's they can check. There's some programs which businesses can buy into where they will literally take screenshots to make sure that you're working at your desk and things like that. And I presume...
I don't believe we have anything like that.
No, I would hope not, but it's about that comfort area, and you are, to a certain extent, going into other people's... It's not just the workers' sense of place as well. So, your rules or your governing of how the whole place works for the worker, not.
Yeah.
I mean, have you looked at just the worker, or have you looked at their family when you've given guidelines and guidance on how that works? Because the privacy can be much.
Yeah, and I think it's also up to the individual manager as well, to whether you're at work or, you know, if I'm going to a meeting at the end of the day and I'm just going to take off home afterwards, you know, the manager needs to have that individual relationship with their team around monitoring that person as well.
I think Sarah has either a question or something to say, so just in case it's something to say about this, Sarah.
So, thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Really, what I wanted to point out was this points to the whole cultural program we've had running for quite some time. And you'll remember that we were focusing particularly on generating trust in the organisation. And so we have operated a high trust model over COVID and are looking to continue that. Trust means that our staff are empowered to work from home, and also that we are not monitoring in any of the ways that Councillor Wilson was talking about. What we do think about is the welfare of that person and how they're connecting into the organisation, and we also look at the outputs of individuals and how that works. But it's not a policing of that, and we haven't had any cause to do that. What we've found is that our staff have been more productive, and we really are operating on a high trust model that I would like to continue.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Are you done, Kate?
Yes.
Andrew.
So just a question, in terms of the incidents that occurred during the quarter, I believe it is, just it'd be quite keen to hear a little bit more about them, because it did sound a few vehicle incidents. Are the staff all right? What's happened?
Yeah. So over a fairly small number of incidents overall, there are 11, and that was 7 near misses. The majority, so there are 7 vehicle incidents, 5 of those were actually other road users. So a lot of our field workers will travel around Central Otago region, and before lockdown anyway, there are a lot of issues with people. Perhaps, I don't want to say that they're tourists, I don't want to be biased, but they possibly are people unfamiliar with New Zealand road conditions. So a lot of incidents have happened actually out around Central Otago with other vehicles driving unsafely. So that's been 5 of the 7 vehicle incidents. And in that scenario, we still encourage staff to report them, so we've got an awareness. But obviously at that moment, they need to be contacting the police if there's a vehicle out on the highway driving unsafely. And it's unfortunate we don't have much control over other vehicle users. We can only control our own vehicle users. The other 2 vehicle incidents were, one vehicle actually left the highway out in Central Otago one evening, and another fellow was trying to climb up on the back of the deck of a ute and sustained an injury to his thumb. So those are the other 2.
Yeah, and so the one that left the road,
The one that left the road, an incident investigation was conducted for that one. A few different factors going on. The person was travelling through a very tight sort of hairpin in the road, and basically there was a cat running across the road that she swerved to avoid and ended up in the ditch across the other side of the road. So a pretty significant incident, but very lucky that the lady only sustained a minor injury. In that scenario, we've got a thing called Smart Track, so we've got GPS trackers on our vehicles, so we can literally see step by step every single thing that's happened with that particular incident. You know, we've got processes in place where we've got buddy systems for lone workers that they can contact, obviously, you know, their staff if there's an emergency. We've got custom fleet that can come and rescue vehicles, etc. But as part of that incident investigation, we're actually looking at a new vehicle use policy and a new safe driving policy as well, and also a fatigue management policy, because the incident did occur at the end of a long day, so fatigue may have been a factor. So, you know, part of our, I guess, continuous improvement is when these incidents happen and there's an investigation, we're looking at, you know, retraining, building in policies, procedures, etc., or safe operating procedures that. But that was a particularly significant one. All of the other ones have been really minor. The other one was a wasp sting, and the other one was someone touching an electric gate. Everything else has been near misses, yeah. But very low reporting numbers.
Well, there's none in March.
Nothing happened in March.
So it should be
nothing
zero.
was reported in March.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, that's just the way. Are you
Yep.
looking at that safety
Yep.
dashboard?
That's fine.
It just didn't show a zero on the
Yep.
bar graph. Yeah.
Given.
Very low reporting, obviously, through lockdown. Starting to see a couple of things come through now.
Yeah, sorry, Rebecca. Yeah, look, also just further to that, so what we don't see there probably is the trend. So, I mean, that really good numbers and a really good explanation, but how does that look over the 12 months or a comparable time with the comparable seasonal, especially with cars and wherever they're
Yeah,
driving?
sure. And look, that safety dashboard that you've got as an attachment there, that's just a new thing we've started. So there's been, I guess, previous inconsistency in our reporting. So we're trying to just build in quarterly reports. However, we can definitely go back and we can do anything we like with that reporting and provide an annual report, definitely. But we're just trying to show things at a quarterly snapshot at the moment.
Good.
Our current reporting, it is a little bit limited, but we are looking at updating our safety system, which will allow us to obviously get a lot more meaningful data out of our reporting for the future.
Thank you.
Anything else you want to say to us in particular?
No, I think that's fine.
All good?
All good.
Would somebody like to move that this report's received?
Seconded, Madam
Kate seconded, Andrew Noon. All those in favour?
Chair. Aye.
Right. Resolution to exclude the public.
Happy to move.
You can do. Andrew Douglas. All those in favour?
Aye.
Right, do we need to switch off Liz?
Tube.
Yep.
Yes.